Walt Cunningham here, Apollo 7.
As Dave mentioned, we were the backup. What people don't understand is how the earlier preparations, and in some cases the deficiency of those early preparations, is where we ended up in that particular fire. Let me back up for a minute to let you know. I'm sure that the NASA people do. But for example, our crew, Wally, Don, and I, we began about 3 years before that mission. And 3 years, well, it wasn't quite 3 years later, we ended up performing at virtually the same test, but with plugs in instead of plugs out, so we didn't have to go through that the night before. But starting 3 years before that, they had a Block 1 spacecraft that people never even hear about. Spacecraft 14, we didn't even have a name for it. Our crew was supposed to fly spacecraft 14. Gus, Ed, and Roger were on spacecraft 12. They were going to be doing the first mission, and we lived at the contractors, as Dave mentioned out there. And we did it because there were no simulators. The only way we got cockpit time was to perform the engineering work. 24 hours a day. They had a place for us to sleep at the plant out there, and we would get up any time that they were ready to test something. We would get in and get a little cockpit time. As time went on, and we tried to make changes, it was the first time that North American Rockwell, or what became Rockwell, they started living with astronauts there on site. It was not like the experience that had happened with McDonnell Douglas, which they were very used to it. So the flight crew, of course, was interested in making changes. We were living with the designers, we were living with the engineers, performing tests, and many of the crew changes, many of the changes that the crew wanted to get implemented at the various design review boards got turned down. And some of them, for example, just the hatch is the simplest example of that, but there were a lot of other changes turned down too, is because that was based on a priority, and I think it was cost, weight, and schedule impacts were always being measured, and I personally believe that the interest was exactly the opposite of that. The schedule was number one, and the weight was pretty important, but cost was really not the big problem in those days. In any case, as we slipped, spacecraft 14 got canceled. And so that's when we came in about, I don't know, maybe 3 months before the launch to come in and back up spacecraft 12, because that was the only two Block 1 spacecraft going, and we'd been living with it as long as Gus and Roger had. Well, when that happened, we ended up then backing up let's call it Apollo 1, because eventually the first, that was what it was renamed as. And when we did that, we had a launch date. When that fire was on January 27th, 1967, I think they still had in the schedule the launch date was about a month later. But we knew that that was no way that it was going to be launched a month later. But, Deke, didn't want to be the guy holding the umbrella on it, so we were still training to do that. We knew it was going to have to be slipped because of various changes. Well, they had the fire. And we never did pin down the precise cause of the fire, but I can assure you that at least I believe, astronaut overconfidence was one of the things that it didn't necessarily contribute, but it left us there. We thought we could make up for those deficiencies that we saw in changes that were not accepted. We were aware of them, and we thought that, well, we were the best pilots in the world, we were going to be able to overcome that. Well, it didn't really work that way. In any case, a spacecraft which was really not very good, and we knew it at the time. 21 months later, over 1,100 changes in that, and virtually anything that they thought might have had anything to do with the fire, or the hatch change, things like that, all had to be done. But from our perspective, as a flight crew, we also were able to get many of those changes that were turned down before based on the schedule impact. So with that delay, we ended up with a spacecraft that was absolutely marvelous. And I don't think it would have gotten that way, actually, without the Phoenix on pad 34, the only one that's ever lifted off from pad 34. But I can tell you this, I think it's still the longest, most ambitious, most successful engineering test flight ever. And it all had happened, in my opinion, because of what we learned and what we were able to fix and our commitment after the Apollo 1 fire.
Yeah, amen to that. Thank you, Walter.